Welcome. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So this is an acknowledgement to God that first of all that we have a Torah to study, and that God has commanded us to study this teaching and to try and understand, in order to understand what our lives are about and what we're trying to accomplish in this world. And so I'm going to open it to the text at this point. So give me a moment to do that. And don't be alarmed by what you see. And of course, there's a lot of ghosts on this page, as you can see, but they're not all that way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the Hebrew. Here's the Hebrew, just to give you the layout of the page. This is the Hebrew of the text of the Torah. This over here is a translation by Onkelos, a very early translation of the Torah into Aramaic. And the reason for that is that when the Jews, after the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, many Jews were sent to Babylonia, and they formed a community there. And of course, people in Babylonia did not speak, they didn't speak Hebrew, just like people in the United States don't speak Hebrew, and people in Germany don't speak Hebrew. And so the Jewish community simply picked up the language of the place. But what happened was that another name for Babylonia is Aram, and in Aram they speak Aramaic. So the translation, the difference was that it was written in Hebrew characters, but this is Aramaic. So it's a very early translation. It's mostly a literal translation, but there are times, no question about it, that Onkelos, that's the name of the author of this translation, sometimes cutely known as Uncle Lewis. But anyway, he sometimes does a little interpretation as well. But for the most part, it is a word-for-word translation. And over here is the Rashi. This is Rashi in Hebrew letters. Do not be concerned if you can't read Hebrew. And notice that the print here is different from the print up here. This is called Rashi script, although I don't believe Rashi actually invented it. It's just that it was found in many commentators, and it's in a way like a type of Hebrew writing, script writing. Most of the letters look pretty similar to the regular Hebrew letters, but there are just a few letters that look quite different, and it doesn't take that much of a trick to get used to it. But I will do my best to translate everything and to point out to the letters. Just for the sake of completeness, this particular edition that I have is called Torah Tmima, and this is an additional commentary, a much later commentary. Rashi, of course, is medieval. This is modern, relatively modern. A rabbi by the name of Baruch Halevi Epstein. And we don't do this too much. We're going to focus on Rashi, at least this time around. On occasion, I may dip into this because I think he has something interesting to say. Basically, what he does is he takes citations from rabbinic literature that Rashi doesn't touch, and but that he feels are relevant to understanding the Torah. And so he puts it, this is the quotation, that he has also altered slightly to make it easier to understand, but basically it's the quotation. And underneath here is his own commentary on what's going on there. And it's pretty sophisticated and sometimes very entertaining and interesting. So we'll start. Unless there are any questions at this point. Oh, I do have another, this is a theory. I haven't read this anywhere. You might well ask yourself, so why did Rashi at that particular time do this? Why did he write this commentary? And in fact, it's on most of the Bible. And I do believe, and what Rashi does is he takes rabbinic material that is quite difficult to understand and tries to put it in a foreign and a straightforward way to for a lay person to be able to understand the Torah with the background of all this rabbinic interpretation and make it manageable. So in a way, it's sort of a reader's digest of all this rabbinic literature without being oversimplified. So again, why did Rashi do this? I think he did it because he was concerned that missionaries were converting Jews, and that Jews did not have enough in knowledge themselves to be able to debate what the missionaries were telling them. And Rashi wanted to give the people of his time enough information so that they could at least engage with an alternative interpretation of the Torah that wasn't necessarily where the missionaries were coming from. So I think that was a very great motivation for Rashi to do the work he did. He was not a full-time scholar. He actually, I understand that he was engaged. He had a wine farm or whatever, that he was engaged in that kind of work. So he did provide for himself with the business that he had. All right. Unless there's
Rabbi,
yes.
would you tell me who Rashi was? Was he a rabbi?
He was.
What was he? How did he grow up, and so forth?
Okay, so there's good questions, Harlan. So he actually studied. There were academies in Germany. It wasn't called Germany at the time, but wherever that general area, there were several academies. And so he grew up studying in those academies, and he was in fact a rabbi. And I believe he even wrote some opinions regarding Jewish law. And so he had this incredible encyclopedic background of rabbinic literature. And so he was able to spend the time writing this material. But that's his background. So
What did he become a Frenchman? I thought he was a Frenchman.
there were no such things as Frenchmen back then. Nationalism was born with the French Revolution, and Rashi lived quite a few centuries prior to the French Revolution. The whole notion of nationalism didn't happen until the French Revolution. So he lived in France, but there wasn't the idea of nationhood in the way that we understand it nowadays. So I see there's a chat. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Lauren. Any other questions? Thanks, Harlan. I'll keep going. All right. So the first Hebrew words already throw an interesting question, right? So Bereshit, which is so often translated as in the beginning, bara Elohim, God created. We've got so much commentary on this first verse, right? So it doesn't even go on in this text until this page. Et hashamayim, the heavens, the et haaretz, and the earth. So very often that's a translation that you're familiar with, but there are problems with this translation. But let's just start going on what Rashi has to say. And please just hang on to your yarmulkes, and just, you'll see, it's not simple, but you just have to be patient and you'll get the point that he's making. All right. So he starts off, here's Rashi now, Bereshit. He's commenting on this word as well. And Rashi makes a general statement. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, said Rabbi Yitzchak. And he is actually quoting a Rabbi Yitzchak somewhere in the Gemara or Midrash, although there's no reference here to that. I'm assuming that's the case. However, you should know that the word Rashi is actually an acronym. It stands for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, which means Rabbi Solomon, son of Isaac. So Rashi's father's name was Yitzchak. And there are those who say that Rashi wanted to honor his father by quoting a Rabbi Yitzchak. Whether it was, I don't believe it was his father, but he is memorializing and honoring his father's name and his father in the opening words of his commentary. And that's why he chooses this particular interpretation. So this is typical of a midrashic approach to the interpreting biblical verses. And that is the way, just to tell you the general way in which this works, is that the midrash, the author of the midrash, will quote a verse from Psalms or Job or Proverbs or one of the books in the third part of the Bible called Ketuvim, called the writings, and then show how that verse sheds light on the verse that he's quoting from the Torah that he wants to comment on. So it's a style, it's a very typical style of midrash. So here we go. This is the issue. He starts off with a question. Lo hayat tzarich lehatchil et haTorah. The Torah didn't need to start. Ela mehachodesh hazeh lachem. It only needed to start, right, with the verse, this month to you will be the first of months, which is actually Exodus chapter 12. So basically, in order to deal with the issue that he wants to deal with, Rabbi Yitzchak is raising a question, which is, why does the Torah start with all these stories? And we'll explain why that's a question. Shehi mitzvah rishona, because this is the very first commandment, shenitztavu Yisrael, that the Jewish people were commanded. And the idea is that essentially the Torah contains commands by the divine to help us organize our lives and to give our lives significance, and also, by the way, to help us earn immortality. And since these stories don't seem to go into this at all, the question is, why wouldn't this Torah simply start with the very first mitzvah? Why all this narrative? And Genesis is primarily all about narrative. And in fact, the narrative continues into the book of Exodus until, with this enslavement of the Israelites, until chapter 12, where God is giving Moses this commandment. So that's the question. What's the point of the Torah? It's a deep question. Why does this Torah start with all this narrative? And so this is the question he's going to answer. Uma tam patach bebereshit. And what is the reason that the Torah starts with the creation of the world, of the universe? And the answer, he says, is given by a verse in Psalms. So you see, we're quoting from the Ketuvim, the writings part of the Bible, and it's Psalm 111. And again, this is all sort of mysterious, but it will, as I said, if you hold on, it will start to become clearer. Okay, so what is this verse? Koach ma'asav higid la'amo. He informed his people, la'amo. He told Higid, koach ma'asav, the power of his deeds, the extraordinary power of his deeds. He told his people, latet lahem, in order to give to them nachalat goyim, the inheritance of nations. So again, if you're puzzled, you're paying attention. Okay, so we're going to find out. It's going to answer the question. So in other words, the he told, of course, is God. God essentially told his people expressed his incredible power in order to allow them to inherit certain nations. And here we go. So essentially, well, I'll keep going and then give it some explanation. She'im yomru umot ha'olam liYisrael, that if the nations of the world should say to the Jewish people, to Israel, listim atem, you are a bunch of robbers, you're bandits. Shekavashtem artzot, because you went in and conquered artzot shiva goyim, the land that belonged to 7 nations. because we know that the land of Israel wasn't uninhabited when the Israelites came from Egypt through the wilderness and into the land of Canaan. They had to conquer the land of Canaan. And so if the Torah is based on might means right, that's a terrible commentary. And we don't want to hold that the Torah is supporting the idea of power makes correct, which of course is an issue even today. So we don't want to say that. We don't want to have the Jewish people accused of just being a bunch of bandits and using their prowess at arms to go and conquer these 7 nations and take over their lands. So what did the Jewish people respond in this argument? Heim omrim lahem. So the Jewish people will say to them, Kol haaretz shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu hi. The honesty is that no nation actually, or no people, owns any land. Land essentially belongs to a divine, transcendent God, that God has everything. Hu bara'ah, why? Because he created it. God created the world. So ultimately, the world belongs to God. Unitana la'asher yashar ba'enav. And he gave it to whoever he felt deserved it, whoever was righteous in his eyes. We are people inhabit the earth in a particular geographical location because God so wills it for them to live in that particular geographic location. B'ritzono netana lahem. He gave this land to those 7 Canaanite nations according to his will. At that time, it was God's will that those 7 nations occupy that area. Uvritzono natla mehem, but it was through his will that he took it away from them and gave it v'natna lanu, and gave it to us. So in other words, what it's saying, if I were to summarize the arguments here, this is the end of this Rashi now, is that the only right that the Jewish people have to the land of Israel has to do with the fact that God allowed them and gave this land to them, which means that the Jewish people have their title to the land of Israel is their commitment to God. And of course, we know what happened in subsequent history, because it took all the time from the year 70 to the year 1948 for the Jewish people to be able to come back to the land of Israel. But essentially, the title is the commitment that the Jewish people have to serving God, and that God is a God of justice, and the people who lived there originally were corrupt and had a corrupt society and practiced idolatry, and consequently they lost title to the land. The Jewish people at that time had a Torah, which would have helped them maintain the land, and they did for quite a few centuries, and subsequently things went from bad to worse. And there's a lot one can extrapolate from this particular idea. But this is the reason, in other words, the reason for these early stories is for the Jewish people to understand by what right they have the land of Israel. And they don't own it. No one owns anything outright. So I see there's some points in the chat I'll see. Okay. All right. Jocelyn, please, do you want to repeat your question? Jocelyn?
A lot of times you're referring to the Torah as Bible. My understanding is Bible is more a Christian concept of how this literature, the name that they use,
Mm-hmm.
and it also encompasses the additional writings that they use called the New Testament. So I'm puzzled a lot of times when you use the word Bible instead of.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So true. If I were to be more accurate and careful, I would say Tanakh. That's the Hebrew term. It's an acronym that describes the Holy Scriptures as the Jewish people understand them to be authoritative. But when I'm talking to people who might find such references as confusing, I will use the term Bible. I myself don't necessarily, I realize when Christians are talking about the Bible, they are including the New Testament. I'm assuming that people who are Christian would understand that as a Jew, as a child of Israel, I do not include the New Testament. Okay, so essentially when we use that term, we're saying that we gave a certain level of authority to this particular material. You're right. I mean, the Torah, when we talk, the word Torah can refer to the 5 books. It can also refer to scripture in general. Judith, I see your hand raised. Judith?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
When we're talking Tanakh, we have the order of the books are, it's like the same 39 books of the Old Testament,
Yes.
but the Old Testament are in strict chronological order. And my understanding is that Tanakh is first Torah, then Nevi'im, the prophets, and then Ketuvim, the writings.
Yes.
And that that's when they were canonized. But if it's all given, if by tradition it's all Torah Sinai, Torah given on Sinai to Moses at one moment, how do you get the separate sections?
Right. Okay. These are good questions. Thank you. So there's no tradition that believes that Moses got the entire Bible, the entire Tanakh on Mount Sinai. The tradition is that Moses received the Torah, that is the first 5 books of the Bible in the course of his life. Much of it on Mount Sinai. The book of Deuteronomy essentially is the speeches that Moses gives prior to his death, but that Moses got most of the material that starts off with Genesis and ends chronologically where Moses was. Shira Beth, I'd like to recognize you. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I just learned how to do that.
Right.
So now I can raise my hand.
That's
I
right.
wanted to say that the English term a lot of times the Jews use for the Tanakh, I've heard the Hebrew scriptures is one way.
Right.
And another way is just to say Jewish Bible, if you want to make sure you're talking about the Jewish part of the Bible. But I think it's worthwhile having an English term that you can use, as you said, because when you're talking to people who speak English, you need an English word. So if people are going to misunderstand the word Bible, we can always just say the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew Bible.
Right. To me, sort of saying Hebrew scriptures sounds awfully formal. Not that I haven't used it, I do. My main purpose, of course, is to be understood by everyone who's in the room. And of course, if there's anything you don't understand, please don't feel embarrassed to ask me, either by raising your hand or you can call me or send me an email or text me or comment, etc. It is, I mean, the question that Jocelyn initially raised is worth its own explanation. And of course, we're running out of time at this point, and possibly next Sunday, I will try and remember, and Jocelyn, if you're there, please remind me if I forget, to maybe discuss the whole reason why Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew Bible is divided into these 3 parts. What's the difference? What distinguishes one part from another? But I would also want you to know that the term Torah can also be understood as a broad level, not just the 5 books, but is also understood as a broad concept of divine teaching. The word Torah means instruction, Okay, that's essentially what it means, specifically divine instruction. So anything that comes under that kind of category is known as Torah. And sometimes the general subject that we're talking about here, where we're talking about in Rashi's commentaries on the Torah, we could be talking about Midrash, we could be talking about Jewish law, is called Limudei Torah. In other words, the study of Torah, because it encompasses a general approach to learning and the kinds of subjects that are covered by this sort of learning.
I'd like to add one more thought about the terminology.
Yes.
People use Old Testament and New Testament, and I just want to say that for some Jews, that's a problematic,
Right.
without going on at length because we don't have time, but that's a problematic terminology.
Right. I personally have, yes, and I'll explain why, because there's an implication that the old, it's called old as being out of date and new being current, and that's a sort of implied criticism of Judaism, etc. I don't think most Christians necessarily look at it that way. I don't feel uncomfortable about it at any more. I can handle it and see it simply as terminology and not necessarily, although I suspect that it was originally aimed as being a criticism, and that has to do with a sorry history of competition between the two interpretations of religion. And I feel it's so important to try and move past that and to recognize what is valuable. And I will be very honest that I have learned some very powerful and important concepts from Christianity and from Islam and from Buddhism and from other sources that are not necessarily Jewish sources. And I guess I do have enough time to share what I consider to be one of the most beautiful midrashim, very just briefly, and that is when a human king mints coins, they all look identical. And when a divine king mints coins, they are all individual, they're all different. And I like to suggest that the fact that there are so many different religions in the world that still point to one supreme ultimate deity is actually, the fact that there are these different interpretations is actually a glorification of God, and that God wants us to see if we can actually deal with that and love one another. I'm going to have to stop here, and I'm going to have to stop the recording. And actually, I'm getting a phone call, which I need to take for my sister. So I'm going to do that. Okay. I'm going to actually stop for the moment.